Yes, I think Angela is going to start us off.
Good morning, everybody. Apologies, I'm not there in person. I would have loved to have been there in person, but taking advantage of the virtual forum today. So I can't see you and I can't kind of react to anything that, any questions I see on faces. So I will look to my panelists, my co-panelists to help me out if there's any confused looks or anything that I should be considering as we go through this. So what I'm going to talk about this morning really is more theoretical. So we've talked a lot and you've heard a lot about the value of data. Dr. Whitfield has talked quite a bit about how data has been very valuable for him in understanding implicit bias. And I think all of us who work in organizations understand and get the value of data, information, how it helps to transform, how it helps us to understand, how it helps us to analyze. So as lawyers are, I'm here to kind of give you a little bit of bad news, which is there are laws that regulate and protect these data. And I want to talk, so this panel is kind of specific to HIPAA and FERPA, but there are other federal laws that regulate data and kind of both in two different directions, one in the protection of data, but also in the sharing of data, sharing of information. And of course, there are layers of laws at the federal, state, and then there's some local laws. I'm not an expert in HIPAA. I'm not an expert in FERPA. I'm kind of an expert in data privacy in general. As you have heard from my bio, I've worked for several different organizations, one of which was a municipality, so the city of Detroit. I also work for a big healthcare company, Johnson & Johnson. The other companies I work for are primarily consumer companies. So I have had access to either receiving data, using that data, or providing that data from a municipality. The main laws that we're talking about today, FERPA and HIPAA. Most of you know FERPA is designed to regulate how educational institutions that receive federal support, how they manage and use data. And we talk about manage and use data, we're really talking about how data is collected, how it's used, how it's shared, and then how it's retained. Data should not theoretically be retained forever. And for the rate at which we are collecting data, the rate at which we are storing data, I'm not sure that data is going to be able to be collected forever. At some point, some of this data is going to have to go away. HIPAA primarily regulates the personal health information. Dr. Whitfield talked about data sets coming out of these two areas, out of the healthcare sector community and out of the education community. And as you can probably tell, the reason for that is because it is highly regulated data. And because a lot of the institutions that are covered under these laws, they have reporting requirements. So a lot of these data then go to the federal government. So those data sets become more available to people. You have more means to access these data. Those are the primary laws that we're talking about today at a federal level. I do want to kind of mention more in the area that I am in, and I would say where the data is trending or where the laws around data privacy, data protection are trending. They're trending to be more protective. I work for a publicly listed company. So that means to the extent that we have either consumer data or employee data for that matter, we have requirements in how we protect that data. And to the extent that that data becomes breached, whether we ourselves that are holding it or whether a third party who's holding it on our behalf, if that data becomes breached, then we have certain rights, certain obligations to notify impacted individuals of that data breach, similar to HIPAA, similar to FERPA. And remember, these laws really are designed to be protective. And what are we protecting? We're protecting against fraud, we're protecting against embarrassment, and we're protecting against misuse. If you think about it, your doctor probably has more information on you than your spouse, your children, and your parents. That is really important information, but it's not to say that that data cannot be used or that it should not be shared. The laws also, in particular, consumer laws also regulate how data should be shared and really make it a requirement that anybody with these data have an obligation to protect that data. And again, as I mentioned, the trends are becoming more protective of that data. And why is that? Primarily because of cybersecurity. There are people that do misuse data. There are people that hack into systems. There are countries around the world that find these data very valuable. You all know it's valuable. You use it in ways that help you and help your organization. So you know that there's value to this data. Well, hackers know that as well. And the ransomware industry has really ramped up. There have been, I think the statistic I saw is that there were twice as many ransomware attacks this year than there were the year before. Ransomware is becoming an industry just like ours. It is becoming an industry where criminals are making money off of these data. And again, think about it. Think about what your doctor has. Think about what your education institutions have. They have a lot more information about you, and that's again valuable data that can be used to commit fraud, data that can be used to embarrass you. And in the ransomware way, it's misuse of data in order for someone to profit and gain off of basically holding that information hostage. Lastly, I want to talk about sharing and third-party use of data. So again, there are ways to access this information. One, there's publicly available means to get some of these data sets. The other way would be then to put a data use agreement, a data sharing agreement in place. And the things to kind of think about in this area, I would say from a best practice perspective, is one, actually putting an agreement in place. If you're going to get data and somebody is, hesitant to give you that information, put a data use agreement in place and make sure that you spell out the obligations of the parties, primarily how the data will be used and who has obligations to the extent that the data is not disaggregated or anonymized, who might have legal obligations in the case that data is breached. In all of these laws, whether it's HIPAA, FERPA, or any of the other consumer protection laws, every state, all 50 states, and if you are a global organization, internationally, all the laws that protect or regulate personally identifiable information, personal health information, have breach notification requirements that can be very tricky and very expensive. So if you're going to be sharing data, one of the best practices is to put a data use agreement in place and how those data, again, are collected, used, shared, and retained. And I will hand it over to the next panelist.
Thank you, Angela. Again, my name is Chad Henderly from Toledo Public Schools, and I'm going to just touch on some of our adventures, I guess, over the last 5 to 6 years with data sharing, specifically with our partners and programs that we work with. So within TPS, there's really 3 main ways you can get student level indicators, student level data. One is directory information that's outlined in FERPA. And to put it simply, that's pretty generic information. If you wanted to send out flyers to all of our students, that would be the way to go. Recently, at least in my experiences, we've been more interested in sharing the operational, the very student level data that allows us to actually make an impact. And that starts to get a little bit trickier. You can do a public records request that does, again, get that directory level information. The other way is the high level aggregates. I think Dan referred to it be more population level data. And the Ohio Department of Education has been improving their data access through downloads and exports. They've been creating new dashboards and different views for that. But again, that only gives you a high level aggregate. And sometimes depending on what your use case is, it's not all that telling. So when you look at a large city like Toledo, you may be able to get down to a zip code, but that one zip code may cover 5 of our different elementary schools. Or you may be able to look at an elementary school's numbers, and that doesn't tell you about a specific neighborhood. Actually, John Jones and I went through data sharing for some of his initiatives, and that was one of our difficulties. His lens was through a neighborhood, and nowhere in our student information systems or data collection did we identify the library village or the Ebi neighborhood. So while Ohio has quite a bit of data that's out there, it falls short quite a bit. There's also certain populations that won't be shown depending on how far you drill down for privacy reasons, as well as I think it's up to about 260 pages of the information management system directory for how to report information. They call it EMIS reporting. So navigating those nuances is also a little bit tricky to get the data that you would like. So that would be the second way. The best way, I think, especially for this group, is a data sharing agreement. And Angela had spoken to that. Over the last couple of years, working with Gale Lake, we've really identified two main data sharing agreements that we participate in with Toledo Public Schools. One is with that third-party vendor. So we may have an analyst group that's going to be analyzing our data. So that's basically an NDA. They won't be sharing the data with anybody. They're processing it. Our biggest concern there is risk with what they do with that data. And Angela referred to some of that as well. And that's the second would be with an actual partner. So with that, the general onus is on the partner to collect directly permission from that parent to exchange data and share data. Our legal also advised that that's going to be the most ironclad way. We try and navigate around it and justify a program that has a legitimate educational interest as defined by FERPA. That can sometimes be tricky. And depending on what's going on in the federal lens or the national scope on data privacy or data security, or what did Facebook do now, the general public is kind of puts up a little bit of guard on releasing that. So as soon as you say, we'd like to share your information, you get a big, whoa, 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 whoa. So we have found that obviously if you have a partnership and you have a program that's working directly with that family, that communication and that dialogue is the best way for them to understand what we'd be doing with their data and how we'd be doing that. So once those relationships are established, then that data can be exchanged. I think I'm going to pause at that point because I can go on and on with hurdles that we've experienced as well. And then United Way's role in those pieces, and data purpose and intention, which I believe probably years ago when Dr. Durant came on board, the intention was established that it's absolutely imperative for us to be sharing data for the community. The how and the technology and the skill pieces, that's the uphill battle that we continue to climb on that. So I think with that said, I'll hand it over to Kendra.
Thank you. And thank you, Angela. After hearing about health and talking about the schools, I'm going to get a little bit granular for a minute as a parent and as an advocate for students as well, because sharing data in the development of a 504 and an IEP plan is extremely important. Do we have any case managers in the room that may work towards that? Anyone that's supervising case managers that may have someone on a 504 or an IEP plan? So the release of information is extremely important. If you go to the Lucas County Mental Health Board, you can see from our mental health systems most releases. They have them posted right on the mental health board. The other thing about these releases is it will give you a good template. If you don't have one for your agency already, and you see a student struggling and think, oh, maybe that student should be assessed or that parent should be assessed. If you go to the mental health board website, you can get their preferred releases right off the website. And then when parents might go to the schools and ask for an IEP or a 504, they're given this big packet of their rights, and they're also told to fill out these paperwork, fill out releases, and then they call their doctor's office or the psychologist's office and they said, well, sure, just fax us the information and we'll fax it to the school. Now, I recently went through this with my elderly mother in the caregiver role, and the doctor's office was, and my brother said, who uses faxes anymore? The medical system. The medical system uses faxes. Cleveland Clinic, ProMedica, they've moved on to uploading documents, but a lot of smaller offices don't. Do you think our parents and caregivers have access to fax machines? Or a car to ride to the doctor's office and pick up their medical records, or drop off the release and then drive back? So how do we help eliminate some of these barriers for our parents who are trying to even get their own records and their own information shared? That's something, and even if it is through ProMedica or Cleveland Clinic, do they have the ability to scan and upload documents or download documents and print them off for the school? These are all hurdles that anyone with a student who's struggling and may need a 504 or an IEP might need help getting over those hurdles. I'm going to date myself again. There used to be in Lucas County a team called the Data Evaluation Network, which was led by Lucas County Family Council. And they came together to do things much as Wendy and Devon are proposing. They did a large research study on domestic violence in the community. They did a large research study on single moms and how they could help support different moms in the community. And their research had impacts, but I would say it probably lasted from about 2000 to right before the recession. Some people retired and it fizzled out. Safe school ordinance, much of the changes we made at the court was based off of research done by that committee. So coming together for research purposes really can have an impact countywide. Looking at laws, I would now like you to all take out your electronic devices, whether it's a phone or it's your tablet, your computer, and Google Sunshine Laws, Ohio. And your top choice should take you to Dave Yost's, the Ohio Auditor's site. And you can see the 2021 Sunshine Manual. This manual is updated every year. This is the most up-to-date Ohio Public Law Records Manual. It even refers to how it intersects with FERPA in it, but it will give you details of how you can request information from any public sector. Now, what defines a public sector? That's laid out in the manual as well. Feel free to bookmark it because you might want to know if you receive a large amount of funding in your nonprofit organization from a public sector, then your records can also be considered public records. So if you have that data request and you have the records available, you might have to honor it as well. If you read through this manual, you'll be able to tell if that applies to you or applies to a certain program that you're running. And then it goes ahead, not only does it define what is a public record and what a public office is, it can include nonprofits, as I just said, but it will also talk about what type of public record requests are allowable and how requests are to be made. Electronic databases are considered public records if you're publicly funded. Now, there is protections that override that from HIPAA and FERPA and those types of things, where for many you want to, you'll have to redact some information as it's being released. So you're going to redact names, you're going to redact social security numbers, you're going to redact personal identifying information, but the rest of it could be construed a public record. So it'll be important as you go to answer those requests that you know what you need to redact, really any of that personal information. And again, that's all laid out in the public records request. Anyone can request public records and they don't have to give a reason why. I would request as a entity that has answered public records, I'd request that they do it in writing, just so I have documentation of it. And they need to also formulate their request, or as you're requesting, in a reasonable way. It cannot be ambiguously broad. You cannot say, give me all your records ever. They should be time specific. And this is something when people are asking requests often forget to do. They forget to ask about what time period. Do you want it for the last year, the last 6 months? Do you want it for trends over 5 years? And time specific, please remember, you're going to want to think about, is it the calendar year, the state fiscal year, the federal fiscal year? which for those of you that don't know may begin January 1, July 1, or October 1. And they may only have the records prepared in one way. So if it is undue labor for them to produce the records in another way, they can deny that request. So you may want to ask them, hey Chad, do you prepare this data on a state year, federal fiscal year, or a calendar year? And you know what Chad's going to say to me? Kendra, we go on a school year. And I'm going to say, Chad, I don't want it that way. None of my other data's that way. But so that's how his records are typically prepared. He might be able to get it for me with another date set, but you have to be conscientious of who you're requesting the data from and how they might prepare it. They also are looking for clear definitions. As I said yesterday, recidivism can be defined a million ways. If you call the juvenile court and say, I want all your DV data, well, many people are going to think that means intimate partner violence. In the juvenile court, however, most DV charges are youth perpetrated charges against their caregiver. So are your definitions the same? Or if you call the criminal court and say, I want to know all the DVs you have because I'm doing research of how often, boyfriends are assaulting their girlfriends. Well, if they're not cohabitating in the same home, it can't be filed as a DV charge. The other thing, children's services. I want to know all the people in your care. Well, are you talking about protective supervision, kinship care, or foster care, or post-adoption, or all of the above? So maybe look at their annual report, see what data is available, and see what their definitions are before you make their request. After you are familiar with their definitions, you'll be able to make a more informed request. In looking at equity, and we chose to look at everything through an equitable lens, we used to use the term REGO at juvenile court, which stood for every data point that we looked at. We wanted to look at race, ethnicity, gender, geographic location, and the O was for an offense at juvenile court. I would also add age in there. And instead of offense, if you're asking from a non-criminal entity, I'd look at referral reason. Why are people being referred to that program? And then if you look at the different decision points within the system, you can tell if your system is making equitable decisions or not. You also may request different types of formats for your request, as long as it's easily available. And in the 2021 laws, it says you can even request microfilm. So those of you that want microfilm, go for it. It does not speak specifically to CSV files, which I find interesting because that's my favorite way to obtain data. So I can look at it and figure out some trends myself. However, I would say that's almost the level of a data sharing agreement, because if you're going to trust your data with someone else to look for trends, you want to know they know what they're talking about and looking the right way. So I would always encourage everyone and every data person, when you are releasing data or information, release it in an Adobe format or some format that's not going to be able to be easily dumped and misrepresented. Otherwise, try to get a data sharing agreement so Chad knows I'm not going to go around misrepresenting Toledo Public Schools information. And lastly, know that different public officials may have different interpretations of the law, and many have attorneys that are working for them. I'm not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV. But you'll want, if you are familiar with the Sunshine Law, when you go to make the request, that will help you get a quicker response. They do have a reasonable amount of time to respond, given their labor force, given what's readily available. If there is data that is not readily available without a great amount of work for them, they can deny the request. Are there any questions, or we can move on to the next speaker who is virtual? Don't know, John, if I want to pass it on to you. There's no question.
I'll pick it up because the best obviously will come last. That's Dan. So I would rather go in front of him than after him. You already put me after Angela and Kendra and Chad. So we're going to try to figure this out. One, apologize for having to be virtual, just a lot of different things going on today, but appreciate the opportunity to be virtual inside of this space. And I also appreciate United Way, Devon, all the work and the team there who have put in to make this happen. So I think my perspective on this is sort of tying a couple things together and in our role. So as introduced, clearly, working for Hope Toledo, as Chad mentioned, a few things that we were able to do early on, and that was in partnership with Toledo Public Schools, because the work that we do at Hope Toledo, for those that may not be aware, is to support and ensure quality education, high quality education from birth to career. So we look at efforts in the early childhood space, particularly around pre-K, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but then also on the post-secondary access side, in working with students who are pursuing post-secondary, whether that's 4-year, 2-year, or trade. And so our initial foray into this work was a dual approach. One was on the post-secondary side, in which we were partnering with TPS, particularly Scott High School, in the effort to identify students that were graduating from Scott and then looking to pursue any type of post-secondary access. And that is through our Promise work, largely funded through the Cadence Family Foundation. And so we formed early on a partnership with TPS. And so Chad and I had tons of conversations about data sharing and how are we going to share information back and forth. And then couple that with the need to share data and collaborate really effectively on the higher ed side. So I am by no means a FERPA expert. By no means am I a FERPA expert. However, I have learned more about FERPA over the last year and what needs to happen and how to do this work in an effective way. The one thing that I will say that I think has been critical is early conversations is crucial. You cannot, I cannot underscore that enough. So as community-based organizations, as nonprofit organizations, it would be wonderful for us to just go knocking on TPS's door or knocking on University of Toledo's door or Owens or whomever, knocking on their door and saying, hey guys, we need information to help our kids. That's wonderful. Honestly, it's cute, but there are rules in place, there are regulations in place that are largely in place to protect our families, to protect our children. So whether you're talking FERPA, HIPAA, any of those things, they're there to protect individuals. Oftentimes it feels like it's a barrier, but in many instances, it is there to protect. And so we had early conversations with folks like Chad at Toledo Public Schools, with folks on college campuses to find out what is our best pathway so that we can ensure that we are trying to help our students the best. On the other end of our stick, which is our early childhood ed side, we started data mining and gathering data from a whole lot of different sources. I will say this, and there's a level of appreciation for the work that United Way is doing, because let's just be honest, data sits in a whole lot of different spots. And so the ability to grab those from those, dare I say, silos, but to grab that information from those places to try to really coalesce around what our number one goal should be. And at Hope Toledo, I consistently say this, our number one focus is that child. And how can we ensure that we are child focused in the work that we need to do. So early on, we started data mining because we knew that data-driven decisions around this work was going to be critical. How many 4-year-olds are in Toledo proper? How many of those 4-year-olds already have access? What is the funding that is connected to those children that are already receiving some type of service? So whether that's Head Start, whether that's Title I dollars, whether that's ODE through the ECE, Early Childhood Education, Ohio Department of Education, wherever those dollars are coming from, how many children are represented inside of that. Being able to mine that data is critically important, because that data then goes on and it has for us to actually inform how do we want to try to stand this work up. As you all know, doing initiatives, people are going to ask tons of questions, and rightly so, there should be data to back that up. And fortunately, we do have data. The question is, and the challenge often is how do we pull all of that data together to do it? So I'm not going to talk too much longer, so Dan has an opportunity to jump in, and I'm sure there's questions. But what I will say from a nonprofit community-based organization who is working with community-based providers right now as we speak through our pre-K demonstration project, for us, it has been crucial to capture as much data, but also to have those conversations early, and then also continue to center the child and the student in every conversation. My personal space with this, but also the professional space of this, is that we should be working to find bridges, not barriers. We should be working really, really hard to see how can I get over this. I often get in trouble, so this is an open period of testimony and transparency. I am a minister, y'all. I promise I won't preach today. But my openness in this space is I often push the needle and say, well, why can't I get that information? Why can't we share this information? And I'm told, hey, this is the reason why. And then fortunately, folks have been able to walk us through, here's the proxy information that you need to have the student sign off on. So then we go to our kids to ensure that the family and or the student, i.e. on the college access side, they've signed off on these documents. So then we can have open conversations that can best help the student and the child as they are navigating through. I cannot underscore it enough. In all of our efforts around data, we gotta always center that child, center that student, center that family, whoever it is, and whatever work we're doing, we've gotta center that space so that we're always working at what is in their best interest. And sometimes it's not in their best interest for us to have some information, because we got to keep that fencing in place to protect families. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be on and to provide a little bit of perspective, but I'm going to stop there and toss it to Dan, who I think is the last quote person on the panel to talk, and then we got questions, I'm sure.
Thank you, Reverend Jones, and that's really tough to follow. So I don't think they left the best for last here. I want to focus something on you said. If we talk about focusing on the child and focusing on the person, as opposed to trying to look at population level data, I think we're going to have a much better chance of success. And what I will tell you as a statewide organization, there's never been a better time or willingness or desire for entities and organizations and people to work together to really move forward dealing with equity and health disparities in the state. So this is a unique time, and we've got to push the envelope, like you said. We've got to ask the hard questions and really force the conversations. My organization, we're an independent nonprofit. We've been around since 2009. We work with 156 hospitals in the state of Ohio. We work with about 15,000 providers, post-acute care facilities, home health, pharmacies, managed care plans. And Ohio has very quietly over the last 9 years put together the broadest network of information flow in the country to allow information to follow a person for care. So we have primarily covered entities, and that's the HIPAA covered kind of definition. And allow under HIPAA, there's many uses of data, but for treatment purposes and for care, data can be exchanged, and HIPAA specifically allows treating providers, treating entities to receive information and obtain information on persons that they're caring for. Currently, there are over 1 billion transactions, which all used to be paper 10 years ago. Now these are all electronic. And they allow providers to obtain critical information they need that they otherwise might be missing because care was provided somewhere else. So HIPAA does allow very broad use and exchange of data for care among covered entities. Where we need to kind of intersect this in is with the coordination between covered entities, non-covered entities in school districts, and that's where FERPA comes in. When we're talking about the individual, and again, I'm going to focus most of this on the individual, FERPA actually does allow for care of an individual, of a child, for information to be exchanged with other entities in the community for care of that student. So again, there is no special consent required if a school nurse or a school behavioral health provider needs to coordinate and exchange information in the community with other providers. FERPA does allow that. The issue really, there's two real issues. One is a technical one, because that information does have to be excluded from the rest of the access of information by the school district. And also, every school district has a little different legal opinion about what can be shared and what can't be shared. But according to Health and Human Services guidance, FERPA and HIPAA do coalesce when it comes to care for the individual. When you look at entities outside of the school districts, outside of covered entities, let's look at the food banks, let's look at the housing, transportation, clothing, those community resources organizations that are so important in moving the needle to addressing these vulnerable populations. Those are covered under different rules. In Ohio, there are specific laws around personal health information. And again, if you take yourself outside the HIPAA and the FERPA, these other organizations are bound by those particular laws. Now, again, let's take it back to a covered entity perspective. A health system can refer a patient to a food bank using the existing consent that they've already obtained for care, because the refer to the food bank is for overall care of the person in the family. And that information can be passed on. But there is a concept in HIPAA called minimum necessary. Once you get outside of the direct treatment purposes, you only have to, you have to share what's minimally necessary to do what you need to do for care and coordination of the patient. So the good news here is when we talk about individual level care, the laws do allow that. What we have to do is have the conversation from a legal perspective to create some policy and precedent that everybody can agree to. We have to provide some technology for the schools and other entities to be able to interact and coordinate around the sharing information. And then all of this is tied together. So for example, we are business associates. It's a HIPAA defined term where we are responsible, as Angela mentioned, we are responsible for the information that flows through the network because we have that agreement with the covered entities. Among all of the covered entities that we work with, and again, there are thousands, we also have data use agreements. Everybody agrees to the use of the data. And if anything wants to be done outside of that, there has to be an adjustments to the data use agreements. And a perfect example of that is when the pandemic hit, the Department of Health came to us and said, look, we have to be able to look at aggregate level information on testing and symptoms and other things before there was other ways to obtain that. And so the policy that we passed is for population public health good, we can look at, we can roll up that individual data to an aggregate level that again is minimum necessary to look at population level effects. And that's one of the indicators that the Department of Health used in the governor's county level mapping tools. So again, the good news here is it can be done. The conversations have to be, they're hard and we have to push the envelope. There is some technology that is additional technologies that's going to be needed to allow information to flow across different organizations and types. But again, the timing of this conversation is perfect. People are willing to do it and we need to do it to really address, again, these disparity and equity needs that we have in the state. So I will pause there and turn it back over to the moderator and open it up for questions.
robust discussion about sharing of data and how that should look. But I kind of want to direct this question towards Ms. Carter, but the entire panel is feel free to jump in. One thing we don't make sure we want to overlook, especially for the smaller organizations who may not have the capacity or level understanding, is the security aspect and liability part. We talk about what we can and can't share, but also about storage. I know when we started transitioning over to everything being electronic with Big Brothers Big Sisters, I had to take an antiquated system and upgrade it, keeping in mind IT security, things of that nature. And matter of fact, when we got ready to renew our insurance policy and coverage, they actually incorporated in the cost data coverage. I think we had to have a minimum of $1 million policy. So it shows you how significant it had become over the years. And I'm not mistaken, I think Ms. Carter also touched on that. So if we can kind of share some insight on your perspective and maybe give some advice out there. I was kind of fortunate because the last several years I've been working with the government. And so I had to keep a security clearance and had to go through all the training protocols, but I was fortunate in my space. But I kind of wonder about the smaller nonprofits such as mine who may not have those capabilities or level of understanding. And so we'll start with you if you don't mind, Ms. Carter, and then we can pass it on to the panel.
Yeah, so data security is very interesting, and HIPAA is very prescriptive about ensuring any entity that is covered under HIPAA having the appropriate cybersecurity measures in place. And this is where the laws are trending to be more stringent, because I will tell you, it's not a matter of if your data will be breached, it's a matter of when your data will be breached and what will you do. And I think you raised a good point, and that was a little bit of the point that I was making earlier about, in particular, nonprofits, smaller healthcare agencies don't have good systems in place to protect these data. And I was at a forum with Cleveland Clinic a couple years ago, and they were talking about, and not just Cleveland Clinic, but some other healthcare companies were talking about in the M&A space, mergers and acquisition space, when they're acquiring smaller practices and doing their due diligence and looking at how the records are being kept and not having the appropriate safeguards in place. I will tell you, it is critical how you store and share data. And sometimes it doesn't have to be super expensive. I mean, just using a cloud application like Box, right, where you can really control who has access to, and if you're sharing that information, you can share it directly through Box. Sending things through email is just it is a matter of time before it gets intercepted. It's a matter of time before your systems get hacked and locked, and your whole email locked down. And individuals are the biggest threat to data. So sending that email off to the wrong person, clicking on that link, that phishing link in an email. So training and awareness is critical for organizations with their employees and with their staff, putting the data use agreements in place, but having the appropriate security measures. And Dr. Whitfield, you also talked about your insurance policy. So there are cybersecurity insurance policies that are out there. They're becoming more and more prevalent. But the one good thing about a cybersecurity insurance policy is that it will give you access to other experts. So should you have a data breach, having a panel counsel, legal counsel, as part of your insurance policy, also forensic accounting to help to understand what the data breach is. And unfortunately, again, this is valuable data. If you were to be attacked with ransomware, there are resources through insurance policies to help you deal with that ransomware.
I think in the Toledo public school world, I've learned about everything Angela just referred to over the last year and a half, 2 years, quite a bit. And we have to be very careful to not have a knee-jerk reaction that goes too far over and slams all the doors on everything as we look to reduce our risks for those items. But Dr. Whitfield's question brings up a really good point in my mind, is that the work that United Way is doing right now actually enables all of that. So just within TPS, we have over 150 partners that we're working with. So that's 150 different data sharing agreements. I was talking with Beth right after Mr. Duncan's presentation. That's 150 different measures, outcomes. It's 150 different ways, to Kendra's point, that people are asking for data or store their data. We get PDFs of student names And there's plenty of John Jones out there. And if you're asking for information on John Jones, I probably have 32 of them in our student information system. And it's written in a Post-it note and they spell John differently. So to get that information, it's a huge lift. And as a public sector, we don't have that. We're building our own department now, let alone being able to provide those services. So those are things that United Way's team, is working towards creating that. And that's just in the education sector with TPS. So once you go across all four, it's huge and it's necessary. And to John's point, these are the types of initiatives that I see that build those bridges and open those gateways and those doors.
Okay, yeah. Anybody want to add anything to that? Any questions in that space? And Mr. Carter touched on it best. When I first took over Big Brother and Big Sisters, I'm not social media savvy because for the past, since I retired in 09, so I worked for the government, I had a TSSCI, top secret security clearance. We're not allowed to do social media. So to tell you my age a little bit, when I retired, I think MySpace was just coming out and stuff. So yes, I don't laugh. My team laughed at me all the time. They got to show me what's being posted and all that kind of stuff. But I think it kind of saved me to a certain extent. I'm not addicted to it. But when I first took over, they had a small footprint in that space. And we put a team together. We worked with Communique and we increased it. But I can tell you almost on a daily basis now, we're getting phishing through our emails, through our social media. And so I instituted training and policies and protocols. I had to make some adjustments. Also in that space, if you start going into the world, if you're not already in the world of federal grants, and a lot of federal grants, they require two-person authentication when you're doing your emails and things of that nature. They kind of bury down in the fine print, but being a person who like to read, I found it like, wow, I didn't know we have to do that. We have to do certain tests and things of that nature. And so you may want to look at that as it relates to your IT practice. And I can tell you, my last 10 years of my career, I was a commander. Probably was sued twice before I went into command. I think I was sued before I retired 102 times. And I was at home sleeping when a lot of things took place, but they go from the top to the bottom, right? And so it's not when you're going to get sued. It's not if you're going to get sued, it's when. And the one thing the juror looks at is what did you put in place to protect these individuals? So just doing simple training, test protocols. I'm still a special deputy with Wood County Sheriff's Office. And I used to get frustrated, but now I do truly understand and appreciate when our IT send us emails through our sheriff's office. And if you click in this phishing email, guess what? Your email locks. And now you got to pick that, watch that video and go through training again. But it works. So you want to kind of put some of those measures in place to protect yourself and to protect your organization, but most of all, to protect your clients. Things of that nature. I can tell you before I started working for the government, never had a problem with identity theft. When I got my security clearance OPM, I think every 4 or 5 years I get an email, hey, we've been hacked again. And like Ms. Carter said, it's not the technology, it's the people within the system that expose us. Okay, so any other questions in that space? I think we have some from chat.
Dr. Whitfield, this is Dan. I just wanted to answer a question in the chat about encrypted email. Depending on the organization that you're representing, so example, for a HIPAA covered entity, encrypted email is not something that would be recommended. And there's a couple of reasons. One is the email system, depending on where the storage, so if you look at Office 365, which many organizations use, Microsoft itself, where it's stored, is not HIPAA compliant in Microsoft would very rarely sign a BA with that organization to be covered. So we strongly don't recommend sending anything over emails. Matter of fact, we have separated our email system totally from our network environment. So even if we are hit by a phishing issue, we would lose our office operations, but it would not be able to get to the data because we've separated the two networks. So again, anything that's open to the public that's where your biggest exposure is.
Yeah, and I would echo that. And email is easy, and I get it, and I understand that. I have business partners as well that, it's just so much easier for me to click a button, send a file to you through email, but that is not the safest way to share information. Faxes seem safer, but faxes can also be intercepted, especially when you have a cloud-based fax application. So my best recommendation really is finding those tools like Box or other data sharing tools that you have security that goes into it. It's behind a firewall. in that you're locking down access to who can actually get the information. You have to have some sort of encryption, some sort of security to actually pick up that information and take it with you. But then again, it's how you store it once you get it. So if you can avoid email, I would avoid it at all costs.
Thank you. Any other panels want to provide insight in that space or any past experience?
I'll just speak for all the small nonprofits out there. Coming from a small nonprofit that's been in existence for a year, we could really use some support on this. I'm thinking there's probably other nonprofits out there that feel the same. I know we have looked at different funding opportunities to enhance our security, but it is something that is difficult sometimes to find funding for. So I don't know if there's any consideration that as we get into larger data sharing agreements or anything of that nature, if there's consideration for some funding available for partners, that might go a long way with some of our different partners.
Thank you. And Ms. Keck, I can tell you, we had this same problem. We're struggling just like most small nonprofits with fundraising, just keep our donors, our donations up to some level to stay in existence. I was kind of fortunate. Recently, Lucas County Mental Health had an infrastructure grant project. And so I started reading the tax laws, and guess what? IT falls upon infrastructure. So I was able to get approved for $30,000 to where we can improve our harden our security, our equipment, things of that nature, and buy the appropriate software. So if you can, I know right now they're doing a big push with infrastructure. I think I think the state's doing another 2 or 3 year long-term plan, but then if our politicians get that bill signed, that's going to be part of that too. So I'm already standing by waiting in that space, and also hitting some of your city and local politicians and things of that nature, explaining them that infrastructure is part of our process and it do need to be upgraded on a continuum. Do we have any more in the chat? Okay, I'm opening the floor up. Do you have any questions for our great panelists? A lot of wealth of information up here. Yes.
So in the past day and a half, we have spent a lot of time talking about data, aggregate data, all sorts of different types of data, but I'm really curious as to what is pressing you in your agency, where you're at in your data needs, and maybe if we can share that with United Way so they know in what ways they can best help us after learning so much about what everyone's had to share.
I guess everybody on top of their game. Yes. I'll bring it to you.
And please know, for those that are in the room and then those that are there virtually, we do have corporate funders that are represented in this information session. We do have folks that work in legislators' offices. We will distill this and make sure it stays in front of them, as I mentioned. So they are hearing you. And so it is a good time if you have something that you want to say now, or if you're like, because sometimes you might feel a little intimidated, please get that information to us, because we really want this in front of a number of organizations and folks to really appreciate, to your point, that the smaller organizations, it could be harder and financially impossible sometimes. The capacity isn't there to make some things work. So how can we leverage maybe working together in partnership? How do we look at our relationships with these folks and just find those avenues? And I'm really glad that we do have so many in our digital strategies committee, as I mentioned, they're great thinkers around this space. So again, we'll keep working through this. And if for some reason you're not comfortable now, that's okay. We're happy to field that down the road, but that's what all of this is about. It's just trying to work together to find those paths so that it is a comfortable discussion, and we are all enriched for that, and our community is as well. So thank you so much. And just know that, thank you, Kendra. I'm really glad you brought that up, because they're on the call. They hear.
Yes, Wendy and her team has done an excellent job bringing all experts together in one location, free of charge to us, right? We don't have it on budget and house capabilities. We may have those connections and things of that nature. And I can say it's been my experience. The reason I was able to move as fast as I was I was able to leverage some of the relationships I've built and gained, and also through connections through Wendy herself. So if you have any questions, no matter how small they may be, this is the time.
Could I,
questions.
This is Dan. Could I comment on the last person's comments?
Yes.
I think we spent a year and a half looking at roadblocks and barriers of what was causing Ohio from getting better outcomes from certain health disparity and equity issues. And we ended up kind of focusing on infant mortality and prenatal care. And what we found, one of the things we found is that regionally, communities are doing really innovative work. And there's some incredible efforts out there to try to address those issues. However, because there wasn't alignment across the state, everybody was off kind of trying to do their own thing. And the problem was the money, there wasn't enough money to stretch to allow everybody to get where they needed to be. And again, as a state, we have not come together and tried to look at what each community is doing, those innovative efforts, what works, and try to roll that out across the state. And I'll bring this back to data in a couple of the questions. I think there's an opportunity, should every small nonprofit, they can't afford to put the IT systems in place and the security around data and everything, or the analytics. I think there's an opportunity to come together and look at some systems, especially now, because there's the software as a service kind of concept, to look at larger purchases and having kind of statewide investments that allow each community to kind of take advantage of. And I truly believe that's where we need to get to. So when we talk about legislative efforts and entities in the community that are important to this, I think we need to raise the conversation from the local community up larger to the statewide level, but still allowing the local communities to have ownership. Those are the efforts we're trying to do at the statewide level. And I would just throw that out there. I think that's pretty critical to get us where we need to be.
Thank you.
I want to jump in here a little bit too, just in the question that Kendra asked. And again, I realize that as a lawyer, I'm a bit of the grim reaper of kind of coming in and saying, stop. But I'm saying slow down, not stop. And I agree. I think as we collect and use and share data, it's not a, it's not a no, it's a how. It's how do we share this information in a way that is protective of the people that the information is about. And as I listen to all the panelists talk, and in particular about HIPAA and FERPA, when we talk about HIPAA, we're talking about patient information. That's the category of data, right? The personal health information. When we're talking FERPA, it's the category or the subject of the data is a student or parent, right? When you start to share this data, or when you start to collect this data, once you start to get outside of those definitions of patient and student or parent, now you get into consumer data. And there are some other layers and some other laws that could potentially come into place. And so just kind of be mindful of that. If you are collecting information, if you are getting consents, then you probably have a data privacy policy. As you use these data and you're providing people notice of the use of that information, if you're using it differently, you got to kind of go back and look at your data privacy policy and make sure that you are notifying people of how you're using this information. Again, once you start to get out of those categories that you initially collected that data for a patient or student or parent, if it becomes consumer data, then you should be notifying, or you should make sure that people understand how you're using that information and how you might be using it differently. And I do appreciate that a lot of the entities, nonprofits, have a lack of resources. But I will tell you as a cautionary tale, right, in the business space, in the for-profit space, collecting data was the wild, wild west way back when. And if you learn anything from all the mistakes that we made in the for-profit area, as you build your data collection systems, as you build your analytical tools, as you start to design and develop the stories from the information that you're collecting, just be really careful about how you're doing it, and again, in a way that is targeted and aimed at what your goals are. If you're truly trying to help people, parents, patients, communities, build your systems and build your and look for tools that really achieve those goals. Because again, data is valuable, information is valuable, and there are people that are out there. There are nefarious folks that want these data. And part of, I can't remember who it was that talked about this. Maybe it was Dr. Whitfield who talked about having to have information or security systems in place as a requirement for data that is being received. This is becoming a national security issue, right? Because again, there are nefarious organizations that are out there that can use this information, and it could put our national security at risk. So just a couple things. I know I'm kind of all over the place a little bit, but just some cautionary tales and some things to be thoughtful of. And it's not a no, it's really a how.
And if I could add, Dr. Whitfield, because I think what Angela raises is crucial. And to Kendra's point, we found here at Hope, again, starting up early, trying to make sure that we share information internally with the folks who we're working with on our team, but then also the folks that we're working with externally through data sharing agreements. I mean, there are a lot of different opportunities, and I mean, you guys are experts, so you may say that these, don't necessarily work. But as opposed to emailing, the whole concept of a box, because Box has the ability to share files, and there is that two-step approach to getting access. You can't access unless you have passwords, so on and so forth. So we've done some work with entities like Northwestern University, with, again, UT and some local folks. And we've used programs like this, or applications, I'll say, like this, which are free. So it's not charging us anything for us to be able to share information back and forth, which keeps data protected. We also pursued, and this could be the case for several nonprofits who are on here, we pursued a couple of grant opportunities with Microsoft, which has allowed us to get a whole suite of services. So this is beyond just data sharing, but this allowed us to get the whole Microsoft suite of services for up to 10 licenses and this, that, and the other. And all we had to do was fill out a couple forms. And now we have access to Azure, and we've got access to several different things, OneDrive and other pieces inside of the Microsoft suite of services. Now, some folks may not want to use Microsoft, and they may be, linked into something else, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of resources out here. And I will say, being a small nonprofit, to Kendra's point, for small nonprofits, it's sort of hard to say, hey, where can I find those? But I do believe that this is where the power of collective approach, to Wendy's point, this is where the power of collective approach comes in. If we know something, we ought to be able to share something, and we ought to be able to share that back out. I don't think we get into trouble with competition in that space. I mean, Microsoft has a boatload of opportunities there, and other entities have those same opportunities, and we should be able to share those with one another to say, hey, this is what I found works real well. And a lot of these sites and applications are offering free components, and it may be free up to a certain level of data storage or a certain level of this, but then if you want more than that, then you got to pay for, the additional pieces. But it could fit where you are in the space, and then that allows you to better share information back with entities like TPS and so on and so forth, so that we make sure that we're protecting information as well as collaborating around
it. Thank you, Reverend Jones, Ms. Carter, and Mr. Paoletti. I can tell you, if you don't have that technology, TechSoup. TechSoup is for nonprofits, to where you can go in there and you can actually literally buy licenses for a little of nothing. I think sounds like you're using TechSoup, Reverend, because it's I think it's 10. So I got 10 licenses, and I just have to pay like $15 a month for the additional license.
Yes, and TechSoup is phenomenal.
Yes,
it's
they have
phenomenal.
Adobe, things of that nature. When I was first looking at it, because I didn't know anything about it, I was looking at several thousand. And I think I spent maybe $200-300 for all the licenses across several spectrums.
I think this conversation is so refreshing to hear, to talk about this really being a cost of doing business. I think sometimes this stuff gets relegated to the overhead space, the dreaded word that we all fear so much. So I won't get on my soapbox too much about that, but I'm just happy that we're having this conversation. And I think the onus is on us to continue this conversation, like Wendy said, with our corporate partners, with our elected officials, to really understand that, you know, the safety of our data, of, you know, the vulnerable populations that we're working with is really rests on us building these systems. And there's certainly opportunity for resources, for shared resources, coming together collectively to be sure that we're using donor resources in the most efficient way possible, but really making sure that we're telling the story that this is a major component of our work. Of course, it's those basic needs, like everyone wants to make sure that we have food to give to the person at the food pantry, but how do we build systems to ensure the privacy and safety of the people that we're serving?
One thing I put in place as I started enhancing our program capability is build slow but steady. So before you rush out there and start trying to collect all this here data, make sure you have the infrastructure in place. Like I said, do not let it be weaponized against you or the people you're trying to serve. You have a vast amount of information out here, subject matter experts. I'm a firm believer, why reinvent the wheel? Just reach out to one of your colleagues. One thing I've heard throughout this whole conference is how we can interconnect better. One thing I've noticed, I've seen in the past 2-year trends is a lot of donors and corporate sponsors are wanting to see partnerships. So, you know, I can tell you right now, big brothers and big sisters are on board. If anybody want to partner in going after any type of funding or support to increase our data collection capabilities and stuff. And so I truly encourage anybody who's here and virtually to please ask these experts on how that should look from if you just get in the beginning stages, and also how we can identify ways where we can interconnect, because it shouldn't be, we all trying to solve similar problems within the community, and each one of them's connected. Me and Wendy was having a sidebar conversation, and I told her, well, my primary function and mission is the youth, but that child have to go back to that home. And so if that home don't have that support, then how can I effectively do my job? And so we was discussing on how we can cross interconnect and things of that nature to bring more resources and services. But the whole goal for all of us, it should be wraparound services. And we can accomplish that through data collection, data sharing, interconnectivity. We shouldn't have to have, how many systems you say you have to process information sharing? Partners, yes. And so how we can, as we interconnect, how we can all get on the same page as far as information sharing. And with one system, we can then focus more primarily on security versus how we're going to patch it in, because through patching becomes weakness and stuff. So any questions for anybody on the floor? Do we have any virtually?
No, I did want to share. So Angela, I just, for the folks in the room, I want to share the comment that you put in the chat. Angela says, please ensure to read the terms and conditions for free services. Just double check, because if you're not paying, you are or might be the product. So, you know, I think a lot of us, especially when we're not super well resourced, we kind of jump at those free products because it gives us an opportunity. But that is a great point, that sometimes we're getting it for a more expensive cost than just cash.
Yeah, Angela, if you don't mind me calling you again, can you kind of elaborate? That's a good point. That's why I kind of went with TechSoup when I did my research, when it brought my attention. They are very protective when it comes to nonprofits. So that's one entity that I would back, but I know there's other resources. I'm just not too familiar with them. So can you kind of elaborate on that piece for us?
Yeah, and I'm not at all I have no resources or anything to share, because I am the for-profit world, so we pay for everything, and of course, you know, we read all the contracts and make sure that, you know, just as an example, I would say, like, even with our insurance companies, right? Our insurance companies want to be able to use the data. They want to disaggregate the data, use the data, which is fine, but we just have to have it in the agreements. But in terms of the comment that I made, if you're not paying for the product, then you are likely the product. And this goes straight to Facebook, right? This is, for all that time, people were on Facebook doing all the kind of stuff. And what do we find out? Facebook is making a ton of money off of us. If you still have a Google account, if you have a Gmail account, and hopefully you're not using Gmail, a non-enterprise version of Gmail for your entity. If you're a nonprofit, and I get a lot of schools, a lot of nonprofits like to use Google. It's simple, it's easy, but you should have some sort of an enterprise license, because Google knows more than your doctor, right? And like I said, your doctor knows more than your spouse and your parents and your children, because they're just data mining. They're constantly data mining your emails. So it seems like, these free services are good. They have a lot of good use and a lot of good tools, but if you're not paying for it, then you need to make sure that you read those terms and conditions to understand how your data can be used. Remember, there's profit motivations out there everywhere. People want to understand you so that they can sell things to you. They want to understand you so they can sell things to somebody else who wants to understand you so they can sell something to you. So just check those terms and conditions. If you're not paying for it, then, you're paying for it.
Thank you, Ms. Carter.
On that, you could be even waiving your rights, the ownership of the data as well. Sorry, you could even be waiving your rights to the ownership of the data or whatever you're sharing. If you're sharing pictures or whatever that are personal to you, you have to be careful. I wanted to point out, she said box, not Dropbox, because a perfect example of that. So it's a litigious world out there, and there's a lot of risks. So be careful.
Thank you, Rodney.
And just also remember too, with these services, remember they can also be subject to subpoenas, right? They can be subject to a government or a judicial process. So even though it seems like it is protected, remember to read those part of the provisions as well, that your information could be subpoenaed by some entity, whether it's a government agency. It also can be a court. That means a private person can come in and try to also subpoena the information. So just, again, be really cautious, be careful, and especially of things that you put into free services.
Yeah, and one of the things in the nonprofit sector, especially in your donor, the donor base and that sort of thing, and all the information around them, that's especially volatile, and really what they're, a lot of search on that. So yeah, I think for nonprofits especially, you want to protect your donors' information implicitly, not just yours, but really, really watching that, making sure you're on those right paths, because that can be really problematic for you.
Yes, I agree. Any other comments or questions from the audience?
I've been hearing a lot of different suggestions like Box. So is there maybe in real time a list of best practices like TechSoup, Box that the panel might want to compile really quickly now that people can take home to their organizations? Like starting with Box, TechSoup, is there anything else that we want to add as like a little list?
I would throw out Force has some really nice nonprofit aspects to it, and they're pretty dedicated to the nonprofit world. We use them for certain things, and for a kind of customer management system, they're pretty good.
Dan, I had a couple of frowns. Can you repeat the name of that company again?
Salesforce.
Yes, we use Salesforce also. We have a license agreement with them through BBSA nationally. So all our client data stored in there because we know it's secure. I know TechSoup is a bunch of, it's Microsoft, a bunch of Adobe, all those companies who donate free licenses. So, and your privacy is protected in that space. Anybody else on the panel have any other suggestions, or from the audience?
Just going back to Box, because we use it internally with my organization. Even the free version of Box is not as secure as you might hope. So really think about signing an agreement, getting a license, doing the contract with Box so that you're protected. We're a covered entity under HIPAA, so that changes a little bit of the protections we need. But if you're collecting this individual data and it's just going into Box, you're still not as protected as you might hope. So really, again, be careful. Really think about reading the fine print, reading the contracts, reading the things that you're agreeing to. We're in a society where people just click through the agreement without actually reading it. So if you don't have a legal team, find somebody that can help you.
I'll agree. I'll piggyback off of something Ms. Carter said earlier. When I retired in 2009 from law enforcement, I started working for DOD up on the United States Army Intelligence contract, conducted training for special ops units. And when I started, when I had to go to National Ground Intelligence Center and start learning about Intel, I found out something that was interesting. Number one, you cannot walk in that building with a BlackBerry regular phone because of security levels. Number two, when the government knows something about you, we go to Facebook. They subpoena up under the Patriot Act. They subpoena these here apps that everybody uses because they know that they have more information on you than they have, and things of that nature. And people freely share that without even knowing it. Another thing too is I still do some contract work. So every time there's an iOS update, I have to call security. They tell me they have to go in and walk me through what to shut down. Every time you update your computer, your phone, especially your phones and your iPads, it takes and undo a lot of apps that you shut down to keep your privacy. So even in the space of you're getting your, and I say that because you may be getting your work emails on your phones, things of that nature that may have information that need to be protected. So every time you do an update, you have to go in there sometimes, just go back to make sure that they that when you update it, it's not still sharing information and things of that nature. And to show you just to give you a quick, since we have extra time here, how strategic it is. I was out in the middle of Mojave Desert at Black Site doing training. I get a call from NGIC up in right outside Charlottesville, Virginia, saying, "Hey, your spot been burned. We training. Who has a cell phone out there taking photos?" I'm like, "Well, I know the soldiers don't have it. Let me check with my team, my training team." And we had a new hire. We brought an expert in to do a piece of training for us. And first time I ever been in the field and using a porta potty in the middle of the desert, took a picture and sent it to her husband. He shared it. And inside your picture is embedded what? To GPS location. And because we're at a Black Site, it was exposed. And we had to stop training and move and things of that nature. So just something that simple. Something that simple, the exposure's out there. So also while you're focusing on as you buy your license agreements, things of that nature, just something simple as your cell phone, if you're receiving work-related emails, can also expose you. At this time, before we wind down, do the panelists have any other information or advice to share with everybody?
Yeah, I from a data security perspective, in terms of systems, Apple, if you can use Apple tools, they really are the best because it's a closed architecture. It's not open architecture like some of the other ones. If you can have on-premises applications, those are more secure because they are behind your firewall. Cloud apps, you're typically a tenant. So that means that it's your data in the pool of a whole bunch of other people's data. So all those things to think about. And I would just say, look, I am a great hacker. And I think nefariously all the time because I get paid to, because I got to figure out how to protect our data. So there are people that are really, really smart and they're always constantly trying to get at your data. So even the little things you do, checking who you're sending an email to, just looking at the email address before you click on an email, look at that email address, make sure it's a legitimate one and you don't hit some sort of phishing scheme. Just be very careful with the data. This is important stuff and you guys do amazing work. So we want to continue the sharing, just do it safely.
We're not promoting Apple, but I can tell you, I was a BlackBerry man back in 2009. And when I retired, they just let me take my BlackBerry with me. And I went up to NGIC, the National Ground Intelligence Center. They stopped me at the security gates. "Oh, can't you come here with that?" Only Apple products because of the independent operating system, things of that nature. It's an expensive investment, but when we got the IT infrastructure grant, we switched over to Apple products as far as in the office, not because they're not promoting them. But what I like about Apple is the fact that the security upgrade is constantly taking place. Also the interconnectivity, because we had to go virtual, we can move between device to device and track. Also they have the management piece like Ms. Carter was talking about, to where I can actually check and do probes within our internet systems and services for our security purposes. So do you have any more questions from the floor or virtually before we go to our next break?
She might just address it. But someone asked, as a great hacker, Angela, do you conduct test phishing and see who in the organization bites to test for weaknesses and underscore training? I will say that's something that we do here at United Way. We receive some of those test emails and we have people who are tracking who clicked and they got some extra education emails. So I'm sure others are doing that, but Angela?
And that is a best practice. Because like I said, us are the greatest threat to data. So yes, I highly encourage if you have an IT team that can run those tests periodically. And yes, there should be consequences. And I will go a step further to say once a person has been trained, if they continue to click on those emails, that's a leadership and management issue and their supervisor should be involved.
Remember, and here as leaders, we're always thinking about liability, right? It's not if we're going to get sued, but when. So you want to have that documentation showing, hey, I've put training in place, things of that nature. Because the jury, if there's a victim, the jury is going to give some form of award. How much is determined on what efforts you put in place to limit or mitigate that action taking place. So do any other panelists have anything you want to add to it before we get ready to close out? Okay, yeah, great questions, great discussion. I know I've learned a lot. I hope everybody else have too. So we're going to go ahead and thank